The eviction notice felt like ice against my fingertips as I read it for the third time, standing in what used to be my childhood bedroom. 24 hours. That's all the time my own family was giving me to pack up my life and disappear. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper steady, and I could hear my sister-in-law Bethany's voice drifting up from downstairs, talking to my brother Carson about finally getting rid of the dead weight. I was 53 years old, and after losing my job at the insurance company and burning through my savings during 6 months of unemployment, I'd moved back into my late parents' house where Carson now lived with his family. I thought blood meant something. I thought the roof I'd grown up under would shelter me just long enough to get back on my feet. But apparently, I was wrong about everything. The worst part wasn't even the eviction itself. It was the way they'd done it. No conversation, no warning, just a cold legal document slipped under my door like I was some stranger squatting in their property. Carson hadn't even looked me in the eye for weeks, letting Bethany handle all the unpleasant business of throwing out his own sister. My chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing my ribs, and I had to sit down on the bed because my legs suddenly felt too weak to hold me. Where was I supposed to go? I had exactly $437 in my checking account, no job prospects that had panned out, and apparently no family who cared whether I lived or died. The betrayal cut deeper than any financial worry. These were the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, and they were treating me like garbage they couldn't wait to haul to the curb. I was stuffing my clothes into garbage bags when I heard the knock on the front door. My stomach dropped, thinking it might be the sheriff already. But then I heard a familiar voice, Dolores Martinez from next door, asking if I was okay. Carson's voice was sharp and dismissive, telling her this was family business. But Dolores wasn't backing down. I could hear her saying she'd noticed the moving truck in the driveway and wanted to make sure I was all right. Something about hearing someone actually care about my well-being broke something loose in my chest, and before I knew it, I was crying, ugly, heaving sobs that I'd been holding back for hours. I pressed my face into one of my old sweaters, trying to muffle the sound, but the grief just poured out of me. This was really happening. My own brother was throwing me away like I meant nothing. When I finally made it downstairs with my pathetic collection of bags, Dolores was still there, standing in our Carson's living room with her arms crossed and fire in her dark eyes. She was probably 60, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, and she had this way of carrying herself that made her seem taller than her actual 5 feet. She'd been my parents' neighbor for 20 years, and right now she looked like she wanted to tear Carson a new one. "Mija," she said to me, her voice gentle but her eyes still blazing. "You don't have to explain anything to me, but I want you to know you're welcome at my house for as long as you need. No questions asked." Carson started to object, probably worried about what the neighbors would think, but Dolores cut him off with a look that could have frozen hell over. "I wasn't talking to you," she said, her voice deadly quiet. The relief that washed over me was so intense, I nearly collapsed right there on the spot. Someone was offering me kindness without conditions, without making me beg or grovel or promise anything in return. For the first time in months, I could breathe properly. Living in Dolores's guest room felt like stepping into a different world, one where people actually cared about each other's well-being. Every morning, she'd knock gently on my door and ask if I wanted coffee, and we'd sit at her kitchen table while I searched job listings on her old laptop. She never made me feel like a burden, never sighed or rolled her eyes when I'd been there for weeks with no immediate prospects. Instead, she'd tell me stories about her late husband Miguel, how they'd struggled when they first came to this country, how they'd built their life together one small victory at a time. "You're stronger than you think, Mija," she'd say, refilling my coffee cup. "I can see it in your eyes. You've got that fire your parents had. They didn't raise a quitter." Those words meant more to me than she could ever know, especially when I'd see Carson mowing his lawn across the street, deliberately avoiding eye contact whenever our paths crossed. Bethany was even worse. She'd make these pointed comments about certain people who can't take care of themselves, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear when she was getting the mail. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in October. I'd been applying for administrative positions, bookkeeping jobs, anything that matched my experience, when Dolores mentioned that her friend Rosa was looking for help with her house cleaning business. "It's not glamorous," she said carefully, watching my face. "But Rosa pays well, and she treats her people right. And Mia, there's no shame in honest work. Sometimes we have to start somewhere new to get where we're meant to be." My pride wanted to bristle at the suggestion, but my empty bank account and the kindness in Dolores's voice won out. 3 days later, I was following Rosa Gutierrez through a massive house in the wealthy part of town, learning how to clean granite countertops and dust antique furniture properly. Rosa was a tiny woman with calloused hands and the sharpest business mind I'd ever encountered. She didn't just clean houses. She studied her clients, anticipated their needs, built relationships that lasted decades. "The secret," she told me as we worked, "is that rich people will pay anything for someone they trust completely. You show up on time. You pay attention to details they don't even notice themselves. You make their lives easier. They'll keep you forever and recommend you to everyone they know." Within 2 months, I had my own set of regular clients, and for the first time since losing my insurance job, I could see a path forward that didn't involve begging my family for scraps. 2 years later, I was standing in the empty living room of a small house 3 blocks from Dolores's place, holding the keys to my own front door for the first time in my life. The down payment had come from my cleaning business savings. 18 months of Rosa's training had taught me not just how to clean, but how to run a business. I'd started my own company, Reliable Home Services, and had 12 regular clients who paid premium rates because they trusted me completely with their homes and their lives. The house wasn't much to look at from the outside, 1950s ranch style with peeling paint and overgrown bushes, but it was mine. I'd gotten it for a steal because the previous owner had been an elderly woman whose family just wanted to sell quickly. Standing there in that empty room, I could feel my whole body trembling with something I hadn't felt in years. Pride. Not the kind of pride that comes from someone else's approval, but the deep, unshakable knowledge that I'd built something real with my own hands. Dolores arrived with a bottle of champagne and tears in her eyes. "Look at you, Misha," she said, pulling me into one of her fierce hugs. "Your parents would be so proud. You took their daughter who was broken and lost, and you made her into someone who owns her own home, her own business, her own life." We sat on the floor in that empty living room, drinking champagne from coffee mugs and planning how I'd fix up each room. The first sign of trouble came 3 months later. I was in my front yard, planting roses along the fence, when Carson's truck pulled up to the curb. He got out slowly, looking around at my freshly painted house, the new mailbox, the landscaping I'd been working on every weekend. His face had this strange expression, like he was seeing something that didn't make sense to him. "Nice place," he said, but his voice was tight. "Must have cost a pretty penny." I kept digging, not trusting myself to speak without my voice shaking. After 2 years of silence, now he wanted to talk? "Bethany was wondering how you managed to afford something like this so quick. Seems like a lot for someone who was, well, down on their luck." The way he said it made my skin crawl. There was something calculating in his tone, like he was fishing for information. I straightened up, dirt still clinging to my gardening gloves, and looked him straight in the eye. "Hard work," I said simply. "Something you might not recognize." His jaw tightened, but before he could respond, I turned back to my roses. "If you'll excuse me, I have my own property to take care of now." The confrontation I'd been dreading came on a Sunday morning 6 months later. I was having coffee on my newly finished back deck when I heard voices in my front yard. Multiple voices, none of them friendly. Through the kitchen window, I could see Carson, Bethany, and someone in a suit standing by my mailbox, pointing at my house like they were discussing a piece of merchandise. My hands started shaking as I walked to the front door, that familiar tightness creeping back into my chest. But this time, something was different. This time, I wasn't the desperate woman with garbage bags and $400. This was my house, my property, my life that I'd built from absolutely nothing. "What do you want?" I asked, stepping onto my porch. The man in the suit looked uncomfortable, clutching a leather briefcase like it might protect him from whatever family drama he'd been dragged into. Carson straightened his shoulders, putting on that fake authoritative voice he'd used since we were kids. "This is Gerald Hoffman, our family attorney," he announced, like he was introducing royalty. "We need to discuss the legal situation regarding this property." My blood went cold. Legal situation? See, the thing is, when Mom and Dad died, there were some complications with the estate that we never fully resolved. And now that you've made such significant improvements to what should have been family property, what the hell are you talking about? The words came out louder than I'd intended, but I didn't care. This isn't the family house, Carson. This is my house. I bought it with my own money, with my own credit, with my own down payment that I saved for 18 months. Bethany stepped forward with that condescending smile she'd perfected, the one that made me want to slap it right off her face. "Well, that's just it, honey. We've been looking into things, and it turns out that when you were living with us, when you were staying in the family home temporarily, you were using our address for your business license, your tax returns, all sorts of official documents. Legally speaking, that makes this house a family asset, doesn't it, Gerald?" The lawyer cleared his throat nervously. "Well, it's complicated. There are precedents for family business assets being considered joint property, especially when the business was established while residing in a family residence." His voice trailed off like he didn't really believe what he was saying. I felt something snap inside me, something that had been stretched too tight for too long. "Get off my property," I said, my voice deadly quiet. "All of you. Right now." Carson started to argue, but I cut him off. "I said get off my property before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." That night, I sat at Dolores's kitchen table with legal documents spread everywhere, my hands still trembling from rage and disbelief. She'd insisted I come over after seeing the confrontation from her window, and now she was making angry phone calls in rapid Spanish while I tried to process what had just happened. My own family was trying to steal my house, the one thing I'd built from nothing, the one place that was truly mine. "They can't do this," I kept saying, but even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure. Could they? Was there some legal loophole I didn't understand? The thought of losing everything again, of being thrown back into that helpless place where I had nothing and nowhere to go, made my chest feel like it was caving in. Dolores hung up the phone and sat down across from me, her dark eyes blazing with the same fury I'd seen the day she stood up to Carson. "My nephew, Luis, is a lawyer, immigration and family law. He says what they're trying to do is called opportunistic legal harassment, and it's exactly the kind of garbage that rich people pull when they smell money. But Mija, you're going to need a real estate attorney, someone who specializes in property disputes." The next morning, I was sitting in the office of Patricia Blackwood Esquire, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who listened to my story without interrupting once. When I finished, she leaned back in her leather chair and smiled, not the sympathetic smile people gave victims, but the predatory smile of someone who'd just spotted easy prey. "Your brother and his wife are idiots," she said bluntly. "What they're attempting is frivolous at best and potentially illegal at worst. You have a clear paper trail showing you purchased this property with funds from your independently established business. You have a mortgage in your name only, and using a family address for business correspondence while temporarily residing there doesn't create any legal ownership rights. But here's what concerns me. They hired a lawyer willing to pursue this nonsense, which means they're serious about trying to take your house. My stomach dropped. So they could win? Not a chance in hell, Patricia said firmly. But they can make your life miserable for months, drain your savings with legal fees, and stress you into potentially settling for something you shouldn't. They're counting on you being too intimidated or too broke to fight back properly. The question is, are you ready to go to war with your own family? I thought about Carson's face when he saw my house, the calculating look in his eyes. I thought about Bethany's smug smile and her casual cruelty. I thought about the 2 years of silence, of being treated like I was already dead to them. Yes, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. I'm ready to fight. The next 3 months were a nightmare of depositions, document requests, and sleepless nights. Carson and Bethany's lawyer kept filing motion after motion, demanding access to my financial records, my business documents, even my personal correspondence with clients. Patricia warned me this was their strategy. Bury me in legal costs and exhaustion until I'd agree to anything just to make it stop. But something unexpected started happening around the neighborhood. Word had gotten out about the lawsuit, and people I barely knew began stopping by to offer support. Mrs. Chen from 2 houses down brought me homemade soup and told me she'd been watching me transform that rundown property into something beautiful. "That's your house," she said firmly. "Anyone with eyes can see you earned it." Even some of my clients had heard through the neighborhood grapevine and were writing character references for court. The breaking point came when I discovered what Carson and Bethany had really been up to. Patricia called me into her office with a grim expression and a stack of papers. "I hired a private investigator to look into your brother's finances," she said. "Your family is in serious financial trouble. Carson took out a second mortgage on your parents' house 6 months ago, and they're facing foreclosure. They need money desperately, and your house represents a potential payday." My blood went cold. "They're trying to steal my house to save their own? It gets worse," Patricia continued. "The investigator found out they've been telling people around town that you're mentally unstable, that you somehow tricked or manipulated your way into getting that property, and that they're just trying to protect family assets from your poor judgment. They've been systematically destroying your reputation while positioning themselves as the responsible family members looking out for everyone's best interests." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't enough that they'd thrown me out with nothing. Now they were trying to paint me as crazy and incompetent to justify stealing everything I'd built. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, but this time it wasn't fear or despair. This time it was pure, righteous fury. "I want to countersue," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "For defamation, for harassment, for whatever else you can think of. I want them to pay for every lie they've told, every sleepless night they've caused me, every dollar I've had to spend defending myself against their greed." Patricia smiled that predatory smile again. "Now you're thinking like someone who's going to win. But I have to warn you, this is going to get ugly, really ugly. Once we go on the offensive, there's no going back to family dinners and polite conversation." I looked out her office window at the courthouse across the street, thinking about Carson's calculating eyes and Bethany's smug smile. "Good," I said. "I'm done being their victim." The courthouse was packed on the morning of our trial. I hadn't expected so many neighbors to show up, but there they were. Dolores, Mrs. Chen, Rosa from the cleaning business, even some of my clients who'd driven across town to support me. My stomach was churning as I sat at the plaintiff's table, watching Carson and Bethany whisper frantically with their lawyer at the other side of the room. They both looked haggard, older somehow, and Bethany kept glancing nervously at the gallery full of people who clearly weren't there to support them. Judge Martinez, no relation to Dolores, but the coincidence felt like a good omen, called the court to order, and Patricia stood to present our case. She was magnificent, laying out the timeline of my eviction, my struggle to rebuild, and the clear documentation proving I'd purchased my house with my own legitimately earned money. But the real bombshell came when she introduced the financial records her investigator had uncovered. "Your Honor," Patricia said, holding up a thick folder, "the defendants are facing imminent foreclosure on their own property. They owe over $80,000 in back payments and legal fees, and they saw my client's success as an opportunity to solve their financial problems through legal intimidation." Carson's face went white, and I could hear murmurs rippling through the gallery. People were realizing this wasn't about family property rights. This was about desperation and greed. When Gerald Hoffman tried to present their case, it fell apart almost immediately. He couldn't produce any legitimate documentation supporting their claim, just vague assertions about implied family partnerships that made the judge frown deeper with each passing minute. When Bethany took the stand to testify about my supposed mental instability, Patricia destroyed her with surgical precision. "Mrs. Morrison, you claim my client was incompetent to manage her own affairs, yet she built a successful business, maintained excellent credit, and purchased property entirely on her own merit. Can you explain this contradiction?" Bethany stammered, her face flushing red. "Well, she was living with us because she couldn't take care of herself. Because she lost her job during an economic downturn and needed temporary housing, correct? Something that happens to millions of Americans every year?" Patricia's voice was ice cold. "And your response to your sister-in-law's temporary hardship was to evict her with 24 hours' notice." The courtroom was dead silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing to stare. Bethany's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and I saw Carson slump in his chair like he was trying to disappear. But the moment that broke everything wide open was when Patricia called Rosa to testify. Rosa stood up straight and proud, her voice clear and strong as she described watching me work 18-hour days, learning every aspect of the business, building relationships with clients through pure determination and integrity. "This woman," Rosa said, pointing directly at me, "she didn't just survive what her family did to her. She thrived, and now they want to steal what she built with her own hands because they can't manage their own lives." Judge Martinez didn't even need to recess to consider his ruling. After Rosa's testimony, he looked directly at Carson and Bethany with undisguised disgust and delivered a verdict that echoed through the packed courtroom like a thunderclap. "The defendant's claim is not only without merit, it borders on fraudulent abuse of the legal system," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Furthermore, I find clear evidence of defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress." The financial judgment hit them like a sledgehammer. $35,000 in damages for defamation, another $20,000 for my legal fees, plus an additional $15,000 in punitive damages to deter future frivolous litigation. I watched Carson's face crumble as the numbers sank in. They'd lost everything they were trying to steal, plus more money they definitely didn't have. But the real devastation came outside the courthouse. As we walked down the steps, half the neighborhood was waiting on the sidewalk, and I could see the exact moment when people who'd been listening to Carson and Bethany's lies for months realized they'd been played. Mrs. Patterson from down the street actually stepped away from Bethany like she was contagious, and Mr. Rodriguez just shook his head in disappointment. $70,000? I heard someone whisper. They tried to steal her house because they owe $70,000? Dolores wrapped her arm around my shoulders as we walked to her car, but I could feel every eye on us. The story was already spreading. I could see people pulling out their phones, texting, calling. By evening, everyone in a 6-block radius would know exactly what Carson and Bethany had tried to do, and more importantly, how spectacularly they'd failed. The confrontation I'd been dreading came 3 days later. I was watering my front garden when Carson appeared at my fence, looking like he'd aged 10 years in a week. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, and his usual arrogant posture had collapsed into something that looked like defeat. "We're losing the house," he said without preamble. "The bank won't extend the foreclosure deadline, and with the court judgment—" His voice trailed off, and for a moment he looked like the big brother who used to protect me from bullies at school. But only for a moment. "I know you probably think we deserve this," he continued, "but Bethany's pregnant. We found out last week. We're going to have nowhere to go." The manipulation in his voice was so familiar, so practiced, that it made my skin crawl. Even now, even after everything, he was trying to make me responsible for fixing their mess. The old me would have felt guilty, would have started calculating how much I could afford to help. But that woman was gone. "You're right," I said quietly, turning off the hose. "You do deserve this. You threw me out when I had nowhere to go, and now you want sympathy because the same thing is happening to you?" I met his eyes steadily. "Find someone else to save you, Carson. I'm done." 6 months later, I was standing in my backyard hosting a barbecue for my cleaning business employees and half the neighborhood when I saw the moving truck pull up to Carson's house. Through my kitchen window, I watched them load boxes and furniture with the defeated efficiency of people who'd run out of options. Bethany was visibly pregnant now, crying as she supervised the packing, and Carson moved like a man carrying invisible weights. I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt, just a peaceful emptiness where all that old family pain used to live. Dolores appeared beside me with 2 glasses of lemonade, following my gaze across the yard. "Any regrets, mija?" she asked quietly. "Only that it took me so long to stop letting them hurt me," I said, and I meant it. The woman who'd stood in that bedroom 3 years ago, shaking as she read an eviction notice, felt like a stranger now. I'd built something real. Not just the house and the business, but a version of myself who didn't apologize for taking up space in the world. My business now employed 8 people, all women who'd found themselves starting over for one reason or another. Rosa had retired and left me her client list, and I'd expanded into organizing services and light household management. The local newspaper had done a feature article about women-owned businesses that strengthen our community, and I'd been invited to speak at the Chamber of Commerce about entrepreneurship and resilience. But the real transformation was smaller, more personal. It was Mrs. Chen inviting me to her granddaughter's birthday party. It was my clients recommending me to their friends, not just because I did good work, but because they trusted me. It was being the person people called when they needed help moving furniture or a casserole when someone was sick. I'd become part of the fabric of this neighborhood in a way I'd never been part of my own family. That evening, after everyone had gone home and I'd cleaned up the last of the barbecue dishes, I sat on my back deck watching the sunset paint my garden golden. The roses I'd planted were blooming now, filling the air with sweetness. Inside, my house, was exactly the way I wanted it, decorated with things I'd chosen, paid for with money I'd earned. Carson and Bethany had tried to take this from me because they thought I was still the broken woman who'd beg for scraps rather than fight for what was mine. They'd underestimated what desperation could build when it was mixed with determination instead of just fear. They'd forgotten that sometimes the people you throw away don't disappear. Sometimes they come back stronger than you ever imagined possible. The irony wasn't lost on me that their greed had given me the final gift I needed. Absolute proof that I owed them nothing. No guilt, no family obligation, no looking back. Just the quiet satisfaction of a life rebuilt exactly the way I wanted it. Now tell me, what would you do if you were in my place? Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and comment where you're watching from.